Okay, it's a great pleasure to have you with us here today, Michael.
Thank you.
It's really an honor to me. Can you give us some information about yourself and about your business?
Well, I am a writer, an editor, a public speaker to some extent, and I run a publishing company called Skirmisher Publishing, which focuses on games and fiction. And I've got a background mostly in trade journalism, which is to say I've written for magazines and newsletters dedicated to specific industries.
Oh yeah, so you can give me some tutoring on how to write my questions and how to develop my career.
I could, in fact, do that. And I've worked as a journalist and written a number of books over the years. So I've really kind of done it all. I'm very much a generalist when it comes to writing.
Okay, that's perfect. Okay, let me ask you a quite difficult question. What is the structural priming or syntactic persistence?
Well, suffice it to say, anyone who can even ask a question that includes the phrase syntactic persistence probably has a much stronger background in the theory of writing than I do. And I say that without any sarcasm at all. My background, as I noted, is to a great extent in trade journalism and publishing, things that have prompted me to focus on practicalities, like getting stories done on deadline. So while there is, of course, a lot of theory running in the background of those processes that I need to be at least implicitly aware of, it's not on the forefront of what I do. All that said, my understanding of structural priming is that it is the tendency for someone to adopt in their writing a structure based on the things they have been reading or even the things they themselves have previously written.
Okay, like how does this, let's say, syntactic persistence affect your writing? Like you work in journalism, you work with writing books and publishing. Like, how do you notice this phenomenon in writing?
Well, the first way that I would notice it is if somebody read some of my work and said, wow, the story you've written sounds an awful lot like such and such an author. And then I would think back and realize I'd read that author quite a bit recently, and I'd say, oh, so it does. And that is how I first became aware of that phenomena many years ago, where I realized, sometimes in response to feedback from others, that the voice and tone and structure I was using was very, very similar to something that I had absorbed, not consciously emulated, but unconsciously absorbed and responded to.
Yeah, okay. So when you write, like, do you focus on embracing or using different shapes of the sentences or different ways, different techniques in writing?
It depends on what I'm writing. If I'm writing something that is journalistic, a story, I'm going out to report on an accident that happened at the lake, then I'm really focusing.
Sorry, Michael. Sorry, Michael. Could you repeat that? Could you repeat that?
If I'm writing a news story, for example, I'm going to be very matter of fact and straightforward in my structure. So I'm going to use a lot of declarative sentences which simply present information. If I'm writing fiction, on the other hand, I'm going to take a much more experimental approach or use a lot more in the way of descriptive words. If I'm writing game rules, it's really going to be very much a process where I am explaining things step by step. It might not even always use full sentences. So the way I write, the mode of writing that I adopt is very much driven by what it is I need to be writing at any given time. And I write many different kinds of things. So that's something that I have to consider going into a piece. And actually, at this point, I've been doing this for so long, I don't even really consider it. It's really, once again, just something that's sort of running in the background for me.
Yeah. Okay, let me ask you another question. Like, how do you build logic in what you write?
Well, logic to me is the concept that elements in a story should organically lay the groundwork for and lead to those that follow. So in the context of journalism, which is something that I can speak to, the inverted pyramid model of writing can be seen as a great method for imposing logical flow on a story.
Mm.
So in this model, the headline itself is ideally a synopsis of everything that will appear in the story it's part of, followed by a lead sentence that achieves the same thing in greater detail, followed by a thesis paragraph that builds upon the themes presented in the first two elements. And everything that comes after that are just details foreshadowed by these core elements. So traditional newspaper writing, not feature writing that's trying to do something interesting or fun, but just straightforward news writing can be a really, really good model that can then be sort of expanded upon really for almost any sort of writing. On some level, I fall back on my background as a journalist, and an awful lot of what I write taps into that inverted pyramid model.
Okay, like how do you see some writing that does not have a logic or does not follow a flow?
How do I see it?
Yeah, like how do you know it is not related, it is not built, it doesn't have a strong
Well,
relationship?
there can be any number of ways. One could be that a writer uses unsupported assertions. So for example, they might make a claim that's something that they believe or that they think their audience is going to believe. And I'll stop and I'll say, well, I don't believe that. I know that to be untrue, or I believe that to be untrue. And because the author gives no substantiation for it, doesn't support it in any way, doesn't explain their point of view, it really breaks down the logic of a lot of what follows because they've lost their credibility. So that's one way that I could see logic breaking down in a story. Another is, and this is what happens to most readers, is you somehow get this jarring feeling. You read something and you say, oh, that doesn't feel quite right. And most readers aren't going to be able to tell you why it doesn't feel right. They're going to know it doesn't feel right. As an editor, I've got to be able to know why it doesn't feel right so I can go in and fix it or speak to the writer about it or whatever. But something that doesn't follow, a non sequitur, an idea that wasn't built upon in the headline. If my headline is about a specific thing and then something turns up at the end of paragraph 1 or in the beginning of paragraph 2 or 3, it has nothing to do with that, I'm going to sort of feel disquieted. I might keep reading if I don't have the technical background to understand what's going on, but the author has failed to some extent because of that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very interesting. Okay, let me ask you another question. For example, if you are writing an article for a journal or a magazine, and then you need to cite some evidence or an example, how do you build a suitable example?
Well, it really depends to a great extent on what you're writing. You know, in an academic setting or any kind of professional journal, footnotes are one way to do it. So you would simply have a footnote that points to the source that you got information from. That doesn't apply to a lot of what I do. Simply referring in line in the context of a story to what somebody else has said can sometimes be very credible. If there's a political figure who I'm trying to either discredit or make look good in a story, quoting them directly can support my point of view. If I want to make the point of make the assertion, the claim that a certain political figure doesn't value human life, well, then I look for a quote from them where they say something like, well, you know, people's lives aren't as important as whatever. So tapping into the words of people, of other people who are going to be seen as exemplifying one point of view or another is a way to do that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very interesting. What is tone?
Tone
Yeah.
is the prevailing attitude that a writer adopts for a story, such as matter of fact, or somber, or humorous, or sarcastic. And the nature of a piece can often dictate what the appropriate tone for it should be.
Mm-hmm.
So an obituary is almost always going to be so somber. A news story is almost always going to be matter of fact. And once a writer's determined what they want the predominant tone for a piece to be, it's generally a good idea for them to maintain that tone throughout a work. And a failure to do so will often, as we discussed before, feel jarring to readers. They'll feel as if something has not aligned properly. A writer might also find it useful to consciously identify the tone they've adopted for a particular piece to ensure that it works for what they're writing. A close associate of mine, for example, maintains that I tend to be condescending in things like open letters to people I don't particularly care for. And as this is a bit of a blind spot for me, it helps me to be aware of it. So making sure I actually know the tone I've adopted for a particular piece is actually pretty important.
Okay, can you explain a little more? You said the tone can be a matter of fact. What does that mean?
Oh, matter of fact. I mean, that's just an idiom that means to describe things in a very straightforward way. So just describing the facts of a situation. And this is what I think we see less in a lot of journalism these days. But in traditional journalism, a journalist is supposed to be, I was trained to deliberately keep my opinion out of a story. So I'm just telling the facts as I'm able to determine them without my opinions. If there's an opinion, it's in quotes, and I'm attributing it to a specific third party. My opinion would never appear in a matter-of-fact news story piece. Only the facts as I am able to determine them, and quotes that show other people's points of view. So that's what I mean by matter-of-fact. Just very straightforward and factual.
Okay. What is a process analysis?
What is a process analysis? Okay, a process description or analysis is a form of descriptive writing that is designed to convey to a reader how change takes place through a series of stages. And I think it can be compared and contrasted nicely with how-to text-like sets of instructions. So while someone reading a set of instructions might intend to use them to accomplish a specific task, for example, such as how to set up a new television, someone reading a process analysis might instead be interested in understanding the elements of a system that typically operates beyond their direct interactions. So less how to set up a TV than those things that make a TV function and what is causing an image to appear on the screen when you turn it on. And being aware of how to effectively use process analysis can be very useful to writers in many situations where they want to convey information describing how something has occurred. And this can actually transcend just scientific or nonfiction things. We would think that mostly we're talking about technical writing, but I once wrote what for me was a fairly complicated scene in one of my novels in which someone was attempting to climb out of a deep pit. And my approach drew upon the techniques of process analysis and combined process analysis with narration.
Okay. What is a topical approach?
What is a topical approach?
Yeah.
A topical approach in writing involves introducing and describing one aspect of a subject at a time. Okay? So this is, in fact, I was just looking for one of my books that I just recently published, but I don't see a copy of it here. This is, in fact, a technique I use quite a bit. Most recently in a writer's guide I co-authored and published called City Builder that describes 85 sorts of places characters in a story might visit. So in our entries for each of those different kinds of places, we start off with a paragraph that identifies what the place is and provides an overview or description of it. So for example, we might say marketplaces, a souk. Marketplaces are designated areas within many communities, whether permanent or temporary, and open for a specific period each week, month, or year, where a wide variety of goods and services can be conveniently purchased in one place. So that's the first topic within an entry on a marketplace. We then continue each entry by addressing various topics pertinent to it, including special types, such as wholesale markets open only to people in certain industries. Relevant examples, such as the weekly markets held in many village squares worldwide throughout history. A physical description of the place in question. other areas that a particular place might be part of. Any equipment or supplies especially associated with the place in question. Typical owners, staff, or other occupants of the place. Any relevant security measures associated with the place, such as the presence of guards. Typical patrons, customers, or visitors associated with a place. And what might lead characters ending up at that sort of place in question and what they might do while they're at it. So each paragraph in that entry would be dedicated to a specific topic associated with that. We have one entry which takes up 2 or 3 pages and consists of 12 or 15 topical paragraphs that address the subject in that way. And this is useful in all sorts of ways. It structures things very usefully for the writer because they can have an outline that says, well, these are the things I need to address in my topical approach to this. But it's also very useful to the reader because when they then go on to read about a blacksmithy or a temple or any other place, the structure is going to be the same as it was in the marketplace they'd read, and they're going to be able to more easily absorb and make use of the information in it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, how to write clean paragraphs?
Well, there are any number of things someone can do to help them write clean paragraphs. One, for example, and this sort of ties in with everything we've been talking about up to this point, is to resist the temptation to include extraneous material. Even if it seems fun or interesting, you know, it might just belong in a different story. And making sure everything you include is relevant to the information you are trying to convey with a particular paragraph, which should be supporting your story overall. And going beyond that, while you might not have time to analyze the presence of each word in something you write, on at least a theoretical level, you need to understand that in a tightly written piece, every single word should be there for a reason. I mean, I remember the first time a professor told me that, probably in 1989 when I was at American University of Paris. They said, you know, when James Joyce writes, every single word is there for a reason. And that was really astounding to me. I mean, I remember more than 30 years later hearing that, the idea that when you're writing, every single word is there for a reason. And you don't want that reason to be that you don't know what the hell you're doing. That I think is important. And as long as you use the phrase clean paragraphs, I'll just throw in something tangential here. Clean copy in the context of journalism, clean copy, that's a term, in the context of journalism or publishing, is material that is sufficiently tight, error-free, and well-organized that editors don't have to put a lot of time and work getting it ready for publication, something they generally appreciate quite a bit. So becoming known as a writer who turns in clean copy can therefore be both a professional accolade and a way to ensure more work in the future. You'll be the writer that they call if you are known as being someone who turns in clean copy. And, you know, my writing has always been clean. It might not always be as creative as some people's, but it is solid, and it's the thing that's going to end up in print.
Very good. Okay, how to provide a clear path in our writing?
A clear path.
Yeah.
I think when we talk about a clear path in our writing, we're referring to the idea that when we reach the end of a piece, it makes sense to the reader how we got from our starting point to our finish. Yeah. It can often be fun in a narrative work, especially a work of fiction, if the reader does not necessarily understand everything all at once, and if the path is instead revealed incrementally. Or if the segments of it are not tied together until the end. So this is something that's frequently done in mysteries, for example, or in stories where the activities of several different characters are presented but do not intersect with each other until after a certain point or the end. But, you know, I'm sort of speaking from the point of view of a reader here. No matter how clear or obscure the path of a story is to a reader, and no matter how the illusion of chronology appears to them, this absolutely cannot be the case for the writer. I'll often hear aspiring, sometimes even prolific, but generally unpublished writers giggle about how they just don't know how a story's going to end, and how they're just as surprised to find out as anyone. And this is really an absurd approach to writing. And an author needs to have a point of view that exists outside of time. The writer can't be in the story, no matter how fun they might think that is. The writer has to exist outside of time, outside the story, and to be able to simultaneously view every aspect of his or her story. And one way I often achieve this, in fact, is to have the end of a piece be one of the very first things that I write. If I know, I have to know how my story's going to end. I can't be surprised. I often end up changing by the time I'm done with the story, of course, because things do happen. But I'm not going to leave something as important as the ending of my story simply to chance.
Okay. How to build the connections and to keep them strong in writing?
Building connections in writing?
Yeah.
Okay, well, this goes back to some of what we're talking about already. There are any number of ways to help build strong connections in one's writing. A key thing, for example, is to understand that any unsupported assertions, which we talked about before in logic, that a writer might make, might be simply rejected out of hand by readers, who will then likely dismiss whatever it is a writer's trying to achieve with a particular piece. So by providing substantiations for claims a writer makes in a story, that writer imposes credibility on it and makes it more persuasive to many readers and harder to refute or reject, and thus strengthens the nature of it. And describing the methodology or logic train that led you to make a particular claim in a story, which you can do either subtly or explicitly depending on the nature of the story, can also help convince readers why they should believe it and lead them to view your argument as credible. So if you're writing a travel log, you're going to, and you want to talk about how great a place is to visit, then you're supporting your claim by showing how friendly the local people are, or how they're gruff, but they're actually really helpful, or how the food's really cheap, or how the hotels are all clean and it's safe to walk around at night. This is how you would establish a strong case, strengthen your premise that a particular place is good to visit. And then, of course, the opposite would be true if you wanted to try to warn people away from something. So structuring your piece is and incorporating material that supports your argument. I think this is how you build connections and keep them strong in your writing.
Okay.
Does that
so
speak
what
to,
is the role of
does that
inspiration?
speak to what you're asking, Nour? Does that address your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Sure.
Okay.
Okay. Next question. What is the role of inspiration in writing?
What's the role of inspiration in writing? Much less so than a lot of people would think. Inspiration is an intangible that can motivate people to want to write, and which can be a unique ingredient that gives individuality to their work. Inspiration is, however, just an emotional response to the idea of writing. And it is almost never enough to actually make someone write or tell them how to. Too many would-be writers focus on the emotional and creative sides of the process and overstate the extent to which they are integral to it. People think their inspiration or their feelings about their writing are the most important thing because that's what's on the surface. But this doesn't actually give you the tools for writing. So if you're a writer, you write, whether you're inspired, whether you're in the mood, and whether you feel like it or not. That's easier said than done for all of us, and we do all have good days and bad days. But if you have some crappy job that you don't like, you still have to get up and go to it most days, even if you don't feel like it. Your own writing is no less important than a job you don't care for, and much more so if you want it to be a significant part of your life.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so how to overcome the writer's block?
How to overcome writer's block? Okay, well, this is interesting. There's many ways to overcome writer's block. Is this something that some of your students or fellow writers of yours have complained about? Is this something that you've heard reference to?
You mean my someone I know?
Yeah. Have you heard people complain about having writer's block? I hear it all the time. Um,
I have many people complaining
okay.
about their writer's
Well,
block.
all right. So let's define it. Writer's block is more or less generally seen as a mysterious force that intervenes to prevent creative people from putting their thoughts on paper or moving their projects forward. So we hear this term get thrown around a lot, but a lot of people, myself included, don't appear to suffer from this condition at all. When daily newspaper reporters are given assignments, for example, they almost always get them done on time and never claim an attack of writer's block. Why is that? Well, the main reason is, and this is key, writer's block doesn't exist. There's no such thing. It's that simple. There's no mysterious force that keeps someone from writing. There's only a lack of understanding about the writing process. What we call writer's block is a syndrome of technical failures. If you don't know what the next thing you should be doing in a story is, it's easier to say, this mysterious thing has happened and I don't know what to do about it, than to say, you know what? I just don't know what the next step in the process is, and I need to learn what it is. So the first thing to keep in mind is that writing is a technical process, like any other. If your job was digging ditches, would you ever presume to tell your boss that you have ditch digger's block? No, of course you wouldn't. You just get fired. But digging a ditch does take some forethought and effort and requires you to know things like the dimensions of the hole you're digging, the composition of the material you're digging into, what the proper tools for the job is, how permanent the hole is going to need to be. In the same way, professional writers understand that writing is a technical process and they consider the factors they need to complete a project and learn how to use them. And like digging ditches, writing is hard work. Some aspiring writers don't like it when it starts to feel difficult, don't want to make the effort to deal with it being hard, and they say, ugh, I must have writer's block. It's tough. It's like if you're out jogging and you stop jogging because it hurts, you know you're stopping because it hurts. You don't have runner's block. You're just not in very good shape. And this is the same thing that happens with writers. So when that happens, when they start to feel the pain of writing, a lot of inexperienced writers will forego working on projects until they either randomly stumble upon the next step in the process or abandon it forever or learn what that next step in the process is. And going back to your question about inspiration and emotions, creativity and an emotional response is important to writing, and they're a big part of what can make someone's writing unique and interesting. They just aren't fundamental to the technical aspects of the writing process, and that's what actually gets a story done.
Okay, let me ask you another question. Okay, you are writers, you understand how your readers' brains work, and you understand how to build logic and how to build sequence in your writing,
Okay.
how to convince them with your ideas. Like, do you people manipulate people's minds?
Do I what?
Do you writers manipulate the reader's minds, the people's minds?
Oh, absolutely. And everything that we've discussed here it speaks to the idea of manipulating people's minds. We've been talking about making an argument and presenting facts. Even if we're just writing fiction, we're trying to convince people of something. We're trying to convince people to like something or dislike something or have a response to something, one way or the other. We're trying to get them to respond to us. We're trying to get them to like us in many cases, or hate us in some cases, or respect our work, or want to talk about our work. Writing, what is the motivation for writing? Just to sort of come at this from a different point of view, it is a writer's foothold in eternity. It is their legacy. I mean, we read in the Iliad that someone who isn't a hero is going to be remembered by their children and maybe their grandchildren and maybe one generation after, and then they're gone forever. They have simply disappeared as if they never existed. And a writer knows, I know that one of my novels, I mean, I know this, that statistically, because I've read so many old novels and fallen in love with them and wanted to learn more about the author. 100 years from now, or 200 years from now, some kid is going to read one of my novels, and it's up to that point in his or her life going to be the best thing they've ever read. And I'm not speaking to the quality of my writing or overstating. I'm just saying that it's going to resonate with someone. 200 years from now, somebody's going to read one of my books, and it's going to resonate with them, and it's going to make a difference in their life. And 200 years from now, on that level, I will still have a foothold in this world because of how I've chosen to make my life as a writer and as a publisher.
Yeah. Okay, that's a really great note to finish our meeting, to stop our meeting. It has been a great pleasure talking to you, Michael, today.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Nour.